Chapter 5. "It's all right," hissed a horrible voice in Paul's ear as the claws bit into his skin. "Nobody's going to hurt you." Fibber, Paul thought, but the grip was too tight to allow him to put his thoughts into words. He decided to hold very still indeed and pass out as quickly as possible. On balance, if he had to die, he'd rather be asleep when it happened. "Mum," said a voice in the distance, "not so tight, all right? They're fragile, you'll break it." The grip relaxed slightly, and Paul could feel something huge on his shoulder, turning him as though he was a page in a book. He'd closed his eyes when the pain was bad, and now he opened them again. Injudicious. He shuddered. "Mum! It's no use saying mum at me like that," said the horrible voice. "How to make it stay still? Let it go, for God's sake, you're probably hurting it." "Oh, right." The thing, the hideous, terrifying, ugly thing, was huge, like a grizzly bear or a monster gorilla, but it wasn't any kind of creature that Paul had ever seen or heard about. Its skin was fish belly white and coarse as sandpaper. Its head was completely spherical, with slits for ears, eyes and mouth, and sat on top of a gross sack of a body like a golf ball balanced on a dollop of weightless custard. Paul could feel how very strong it was, but where it kept its muscles was anybody's guess. He didn't even bother trying to peer over its shoulder for a look at the owner of the other voice. "Sorry, yes." The thing appeared to be concentrating, as if about to try something difficult, but it relaxed its grip a little, which is nice. "Now then, dear," said the thing, "can you understand what I'm saying?" "Dear? Yes," Paul mumbled. Who are you?" "See, Mum, I told you they can understand everything we say." "Yes, all right." The thing frowned, a neat trick since it had no eyebrows. "Hello," it said, then hesitated. Tongue-tied? A shy monster? "Now then, there's nothing to be frightened of. I'm not going to hurt you. Are you all right?" Yes," Paul gasped. "You won't try and run away or anything?" Paul shook his head. Promise?" he added. "All right," the thing said, and let go of Paul's throat completely. He staggered back and landed in his chair, the one he'd been sitting in watching television before his life got all cluttered up with monsters. "That's right," cooed the thing approvingly. "You settle down and we'll have a nice chat. Would you like that?" "No," Paul thought. "Absolutely not." "Yes," he said, feverishly maintaining eye contact. "That'll be great." "See," said the other voice smugly, "they're just like people, really." The thing didn't sit down, mostly because it had nothing, at least nothing specific, to sit down with. Rather, it sort of coagulated on an area of carpet. "I hope we didn't startle you," it said. "No, not at all," Paul said. "That's all right then. Now, I expect you're wondering who we are." Tact, Paul thought. "Well, a bit," he said. The thing nodded. "I don't think we've actually met before." Behind its shoulder, another round, featureless head bobbed politely. Paul tried to smile, but his face had gone numb. "We know you, of course, but you don't know us." Sorry," Paul said, but how do you know me? I mean, I'm not famous or anything." For a moment, Paul was sure the thing was about to bite him, but it was just a smile. Its teeth, he couldn't help noticing, were brown. "The thing is, dear," it said, "we're here to help you. That's right, isn't it, Pumpkin?" "That's right," the other one said, which seemed to clear that up. "Good," said Paul nervously. How exactly?" The thing's face reshaped itself into a kind of soggy pout. "I'm afraid you're in great danger," it said. That, in Paul's view, was stating the obvious. "Oh, yes." The thing nodded again. We can't tell you very much, unfortunately, so you'll just have to take our word for it, but, it was thinking again. Well, you saw just now on your talking box thing, a sigh from the middle distance. Telegraph, ma'am, they call them telegraphs. The place where you work, the thing went on, got blown up, remember? Yes, Paul said. He had forgotten. Being strangled by nightmare monsters can do that to a person. I saw it on the news. The what, dear? Sorry, the Telegraph. There was a report about it. Well, the thing appeared to have lost its thread. Anyway, that explosion, it was in your room, the place where you sit all day. It was... I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but it was meant for you. Oh, Paul said. The thing's narrow yellow eyes clouded slightly. It was, what's the expression? A burglary trap. Someone connects up the exploding thing to the handle of your big metal box for keeping things in, so that the next time you opened it, you'd be blown up. But the goblins must have gone in your office and played with it and set it off by accident. The thing looked grave. I'm very sorry, it said. It must be rather a shock for you. You betcha, Paul thought. Well, yes, he said. Can you tell me who did it? Now the thing was looking very sad. I'd tell you if I knew, it said, but I'm afraid it was probably one of us. I'm so sorry, it added, but you see, some of us are very frightened. Frightened? Paul repeated. That's right, and when they're frightened, people could do some very silly things. It's this dreadful war, it went on bitterly. If we're not careful, it'll ruin everything. But they don't see that, of course. All they can think about is trying to beat the other side. Quite ridiculous, the whole thing. Excuse me, Paul interrupted tentatively. But what war? The thing looked shocked. You don't know about the war? Sorry. Oh. The thing pursed its palpable absence of lips. They haven't told you about the war? Oh dear. It's all right, Paul said. They don't tell me anything. What war? The Civil War, the thing said wretchedly. Us against them, or really us against us, which is why it's so sad. The point is, it continued, lowering its voice, we aren't doing at all well, and you're the hero, strictly speaking, until the other hero gets back, the blonde one with the nice eyes. So really, it's just self-defence. Well, self-defence in advance, anyhow. They wanted to get you before you got them. That's what I'm trying to say. Do you understand? Paul dipped his head. Sort of like a preemptive strike, you mean? Oh, what, dear? You think the enemy's going to get you, Paul explained, so you get him first, like Pearl Harbor, that sort of thing. Pearl what? This war, Paul persevered, who's fighting who, and what's it got to do with me? I'm no threat to anybody. I can't even squash spiders. The thing looked gravely at him. Now that's not quite true, is it? It said reproachfully. You're a dragon slayer. I can smell its blood upon your hands. At least, it added thoughtfully, I can smell its blood. It sounded so silly put like that. The thing had even pronounced the capital D. It was an accident, he said. Honest, and I'm not what you said. I'm an assistant trainee. He broke off. The thing was still gazing at him. What? He said. Really and truly, it was an accident. Mr. Tanner's mum, his voice dried up. Goblins fooling about, she'd said. Some goblins had opened the filing cabinet drawer and got themselves blown up, in which case they'd be dead. And he knew a goblin, not that she was his friend, more like an unmitigated pest, but he knew her, and she couldn't be dead, could she? Things like that didn't really happen. Until the nice-looking one gets back, the thing was saying. You're the senior hero in this area, and we're monsters, she said sadly, which means your job is to kill us. If someone comes along and asks to have one of us killed, and you slew the dragon... I sat on it for pity's sake, Paul protested. The thing shook its head. It doesn't make any difference, it said. But we haven't come here to argue. We just thought you ought to know you're in danger. And so's the thing's bleached skin coloured faintly pink. You're female, it said. She's in deadly peril too. Oh, Paul said, and realised his first thought had been Mel's, but, he said, which one? Now the thing looked shocked. Sorry, dear. Which, female do you mean? Only he knew that expression. Oh, it said, my mistake. Only I got the impression that humans mate for life. It says so in the encyclopedia. Paul wilted slightly. Well, he said, they're supposed to, I guess, but it doesn't always... I see. The thing had no lips to purse, but pursed them anyway. Well, anyway, I don't know which female they're on about, but I have it on very good authority that she's in terrible danger, and we thought you ought to know. Now we'd best be going. They were looking at him again. Goodbye, dear, said the mum thing. Do take care. Then he felt as though he was falling through the air, which turned out to be true, though in the event he only fell a little way from his chair to the floor. He opened his eyes. Bugger, he said. No trace of any things, just the TV burbling quietly to itself and the clock reading 1:25 a.m. He'd fallen asleep in his chair, had a bad dream. On the table next to his chair he saw the empty pizza plate and coffee mug. Caffeine and mozzarella cheese, just plain biochemistry, nothing more. Yes, but... Paul thought for a moment and then got up and went to the bathroom. In the mirror he could see the red claw marks on his neck, plain as anything. Bloody hell, he thought. If I show up to work at the office with marks on my neck, people are going to think... And then he remembered. Explosion. What office? 7 half-sleepless hours later, Paul stood on the pavement opposite a hall where 70 St Mary Axe should have been. All in all, he thought he was getting sick and tired of halls. Strictly speaking, it wasn't a hall. During the night, they'd rigged up hoardings. In fact, this being London, the hoardings were already covered in red, yellow and green fly posters. There was also white and yellow police tape, a crowd of people staring, and a TV crew. A power-dressed female was talking earnestly to a camera, while a couple of kids tried to sneak behind her shoulder and wave. Curious, Paul thought. Last week, if someone had told me J.W.W. was going to get blown sky high, I'd have grinned like an ape. No J.W.W., no employment contract, no more doing bizarre and scary things to fear being tortured by Mr. Tanner. Free! But now, standing looking at the scaffolding poles and plywood sheet, he felt a surge of anger and a tiny voice inside his head saying, "Welcome to the war." War. And what fucking war would that be? Mr. Carpenter. Paul spun round so fast that he nearly knocked Countess Judy over. I tried to telephone, but I guess you'd already left. She looked exactly the same as when he'd last seen her, except for a very faint green glow right at the back of her eyes. He tried to think of some way of asking the obvious question. Actually, she said, this is rather fortuitous. You may recall what we were talking about yesterday. Yesterday, he could just remember that far back, if he tried. Effective magic, he said, then looked round sharply to see if anybody was listening, but none of the gawpers or media types were interested in them. Quite so, Countess Judy replied, and here's an excellent example of it in action. Paul frowned. Sorry? I don't follow. She raised an eyebrow. Come with me, she said. Don't worry, she added. Nobody'll see us. She walked straight in front of the TV camera, past the crowd, not over or under, but through the yellow tape and into the hoarding. Oh well, Paul thought, and followed her. Sure enough, as he got close to them, they seemed to shift, like the end of a rainbow, and he was standing outside the front door of the office. As far as he could tell, it looked perfectly normal. Effective magic, the Countess explained, pushing the door open. Simple glamour. They think they can see a hoarding in an instant line, and that satisfies their curiosity. They don't expect to see more. Well, she added, come on. It's perfectly safe. The door felt real enough, and inside reception was just as it had been the day before, and there, behind the desk, was Melt, and she was smiling at him. So really, he said, There wasn't a bomb. A cloud passed across the Countess's face. Oh, there was a bomb, she said, with unmistakable anger in her voice, and the damage was quite extensive. Mr. Suslovich was here most of the night repairing it, but everything's back to normal now. She paused, standing directly in front of the reception desk. You're aware, I take it, that the bomb was placed in your filing cabinet? Paul nodded. How would he have known that, though? It hadn't been on the news. Mum, the thing had told him. Was it? Yes. Oh, Paul said. I mean, why? Why would anybody want to kill me? The Countess frowned. You're assuming it was meant for you personally, she said. Do you have any grounds for that assumption? Paul shrugged. I suppose I just jumped to conclusions, he said. So you don't think... Her face was completely neutral. It's too early to form a reasoned hypothesis, she said. However, you'll be relieved to hear that nothing was damaged. It took a moment for that to sink in. Nothing? Nothing. Not even the cabinet? What about the files and stuff inside? Surely they must have been... Nothing, Countess Judy said again. It's not this firm's policy to allow acts of petty vandalism to disrupt our work. Accordingly, we take precautions as a matter of course. You will find that everything is precisely as you left it last night. Colour me impressed, Paul thought. Backing up files was one thing, but an entire building and its contents... Well then, he said feebly, that's good. No harm done and nobody hurt. That's... He stopped short. There'd been a flicker in her face when he'd said nobody hurt. Nobody was hurt, were they? She didn't answer. Instead, she moved away from him and picked up some letters from the front desk. Ah, she said. Excellent. Your family history. Please wait in your office until I've had a chance to look at this. I'll send for you. She walked out, leaving Paul standing. What, Mel said, was all that about? He'd forgotten she was there. Search me, he replied. Look, I'm not dreaming, am I? It was on the news last night. This place getting blown up? Mel's shrugged. Well, I thought so, and I was thinking, oh well, back to job hunting again. And then Mr. Tanner rang me at 7 o'clock this morning, just said, be here as usual, and here I am. She looked around and then added, doesn't look all that blown up to me. Like, for instance, everything's exactly where I left it on the desk last night. You'd have thought that something would have got moved, but what was all that about it being your office that the bomb was in? Paul hesitated before answering. You heard what she said, he replied. Makes sense, I suppose, she replied. After all, your office is pretty much the centre of the building. Is it? Mel's looked at him. Well, yes, and I don't know anything about demolition, but I suppose if you want to blow somewhere up, the middle's probably the best place to plant your bomb. Right, Paul said. That hadn't occurred to him, of course, mostly because he still had only a very sketchy idea of the geography of the place. He knew that if he went up such and such a staircase, turned right, and then left again, 9 times out of 10 he'd find himself outside his office door. For all that told him about the layout of the building, however, it might just as well have been trans-dimensional folds in hyperspace. Paul had long since faced up to the fact that when he died, he'd probably managed to get lost inside his own coffin. Well, he said, that explains that then. He broke off. Meltz was looking at him, her head slightly sideways, her nose twitched. Oh, buggery, he thought, she's looking at my neck. See you later, he mumbled and fled. He stood in the corridor outside his office for maybe a full minute before he found the courage to go inside. If they'd been right, and the bomb had been set off when an over-inquisitive goblin started poking about inside his filing cabinet, then it stood to reason, surely, that at least one goblin must have died there last night, in a particularly flamboyant manner. Paul had never seen a dead body, or been in a room where someone had recently died. Death was something that happened to superfluous relatives he hardly knew, in distant hospitals. He was aware that the partners were very clever at magical cleaning and tidying, or was it just effective magic making the place look spick and span after the nightly revels of Mr. Tanner's relations? But he didn't relish the thought of spending time sitting in a chair that had recently been misted with a fine spray of vaporized goblin. But there was nothing to see, nor faint lingering smells, nor telltale stickiness in the chair vinyl or the desktop. As Paul sat down, he reflected on how little he actually knew about goblins. Was it a safe assumption that getting blown up did actually kill them? Quite possibly not. In which case he was curling his toes and puckering his guts for nothing. Mr. Tanner's mum would probably tell him if he happened to run into her at some point, assuming, of course, that she'd survived the blast. Mr. Carpenter. Countess Judy was standing in the doorway. He hadn't heard her approach. "Follow me, please." She led him along corridors and up and down staircases that he couldn't remember having seen before, to a small, windowless room at the end of a long passageway. His sense of direction told him that they were down in some kind of basement. The room was bare-walled, uncarpeted, and empty apart from a plain pine table and 2 plastic stacking chairs. "I've only had time to glance at this," she said, holding up the paper he'd shown him earlier, "but it would appear that you're qualified by birth to practice effective magic." "Ah, right," Paul said. Apparently he'd passed then. What joy. "However," Countess Judy went on, "an emergency has arisen requiring urgent input from a member of the Pest Control Division. Right now," she added mournfully, "you're the only representative of the division on the premises." Am I?" Paul said, startled. But what about Benny? I mean, Mr. Shumway," the Countess said grimly, "is currently indisposed." She hesitated, then added, "And that, in fact, is the emergency. Mr. Shumway has been abducted and is being held hostage, most probably by the same terrorist group that planted the bomb." Fuck, Paul thought. It was a good, flexible, one-size-fits-all reaction covering a variety of issues, including genuine horror at Benny's plight and even more genuine terror at the thought that Paul himself was now, by implication, duty hero. That's awful," he said. "Indeed, but not," she went on, "entirely unexpected. I sent Mr. Shumway to find Mr. Wormtoter." "Ah," Paul said. "Mr. Wormtoter," the Countess said, "should have returned from his assignment 3 days ago. I suspected that something might be amiss, and last night I asked Mr. Shumway to investigate. This morning, just before 6 o'clock, I found this outside my door." She produced, Paul didn't see from where, a long, narrow grey cardboard box. Inside was something that looked vaguely like the stuffing out of an old-fashioned sofa. "Mr. Shumway's beard," the Countess explained. "I fear there can only be one explanation. Mr. Shumway has fallen into the hands of an enemy." More fuck, Paul thought. Fuck with double buggery. A cherry and a little red and white striped umbrella. "I see," he said. "But what—" "So it's fortuitous," the Countess went on, "that you've completed your vocational training in pest control and are equipped to deal with this situation. Feel free, of course, to make use of whatever resources you need. Mr. Shumway's safe return is, needless to say, our top priority." Yes, but... "Countess," Paul said nervously, "that's absolutely fine, but really, I haven't got any experience or anything like that. All I've done so far is a load of paperwork and sitting on one small dragon. Couldn't someone else go instead? I mean, what about Mr. Suslovich or Professor Van Spee? They're, well, proper wizards. I'm just a clerk." She looked at him for a very long time, and he came to realise that there are worse things in the world than chasing off after dangerous lunatics. High on the list of such things was being stared at by Countess Judy. When at last she spoke, her voice was cold and hard as a VAT inspector's heart. "We have no definite leads," she said, "only suspicions. However, in the light of the current situation, it's hard to see that this is a coincidence." What situation? And then Paul remembered. Something about a war, us and them, dreams and nightmares. "You mean the war?" he hazarded. "Precisely." He nodded and then asked, Excuse me, but what war?" She raised both eyebrows at him, a truly alarming sight. "The war, Mr. Carpenter. The armed conflict among the Fae. Don't you ever read memos?" "There's a time for lying and saving face." "No," he said. "At least I thought I did. but apparently not. Will you please tell me what war? A tiny little sigh. Then the Countess said, It's not so much a war as a rebellion. A dissident separatist faction among my people has seen fit to make a unilateral declaration of cessation. It's this faction that we believe is behind the bombing attempt and Mr. Shumway's abduction. It'd take too long to brief you on the issues involved. You just have to take it from me that the separatists are callous, ruthless criminals who will stop at nothing to further their cause. Hence the need to retrieve Mr. Shumway as quickly as possible. Paul slumped a little. If Benny really was in danger, and if Paul was genuinely the only person who was qualified to go and rescue him, there was no point in trying to wriggle out of it. And if Benny's captors were these dissident Fae, they were, by definition, the enemy, and to hell with any issues. It's all right, he said. I'll go. He stopped and then added, Go where? Quite unexpectedly, Countess Judy laughed. Now you're actually beginning to sound like a hero, Mr. Carpenter. Most encouraging. I was sure my faith in you wasn't misplaced. Well, he'd walked into that one like a plate glass window. Really, he said. I'm not quite sure. But I was. Her eyes were cold as steel. At your interview, you may recall that there were other candidates, and very impressive some of them were, too. I had to argue long and hard on your behalf with some of my partners. But I was right, and besides, you did answer the questions correctly. There was no other choice. Paul thought. That's not the way I remember it, but what the hell? Thanks, he muttered. Now, what have I got to do? There's heroism, which is basically just killing wildlife and retrieving missing persons and lost property. And there's courage. Courage is setting sail into the turbulent currents of the North Circular Road, alone in a Volkswagen Polo, at the height of the rush hour. For some reason, the Countess had insisted that Paul should drive to High Wycombe rather than catch a train or a coach. He couldn't imagine why, unless it was pure malice on her part. He wasn't a very good driver, and he had a mortal fear of roundabouts. The car wasn't helping either. Pay attention! Barked Monica's voice from the car radio. You could have gone then, but now it's too late. Dritte Perfschilder. Third gear, for the love of the Almighty. Now look, you're in the wrong lane. No, this is wrong. Links fahren. He tried switching the radio off, but it didn't work. Neither did ripping off the faceplate or stuffing digestive biscuits into the tape slot. Not now, he pleaded. Shut up, Monica, please. Eventually, he cleared the Hillingdon roundabout, and the M40 enfolded him in her strong arms, sweeping him effortlessly out towards the setting sun. Once they were on the motorway, Monica seemed to calm down a little, which was a blessing. I am studying here the map of High Wycombe, she announced crisply. I have located Grasmere Drive. It will be very simple to find. First, we shall need to follow the signs for Marlow and Maidenhead. Paul tuned her out and went back to asking himself, what am I doing here, for crying out loud? Think about it. If Benny was sent out here and he got captured, what sort of chance am I going to have? Lamb to the... You have no self-confidence, Monica interrupted. You should be positive. It is not good to dwell on the likelihood of failure. That was the last straw and a half. Fucking hell, Monica, he snapped. Can you read what I'm thinking? Natürlich, she replied calmly. I was, before my transformation, a fully qualified Seelritter. I do not know what is in English. In Germany it is taught as a core skill. We are very methodical, she added proudly, in our vocational training, not like in this country where you must pick up as you go past. Unfortunately, he'd run out of digestive biscuits some time ago. Fine, he said. Would you mind terribly not doing it? Especially, he added, when I'm driving. I'm trying only to help, Monica said, offended. To me it is no pleasure seeing inside the mind like... Thanks, Paul said, very firmly indeed. Look, is this our junction? Yeah, follow the signs for the town centre until we reach a double roundabout, and then left. Finding Grasmere Drive wasn't quite as straightforward as Monica had predicted, and it was pitch dark by the time they got there. The headlights revealed a row of pebble-dashed bungalows, white weatherboarded hedgeless, each with an Audi or a pristine 4x4 standing outside like stone sphinxes, guarding a pharaoh's tomb. Are you sure this is the right place? Paul asked again. Of course I am sure. Monica replied impatiently. There is in High Wycombe only one Glassfield Drive, and here is number 74. You should get out and ring the doorbell. Paul sighed. Yes, he said. I suppose I should. It would have been just a little bit comforting, he thought, if he'd brought some equipment with him. Not that he really had the faintest idea how to use any of it. Benny had shown him how to wave the swords and load the guns and prime the bombs and all the rest of it, but he knew he wouldn't be able to remember rather complicated technical stuff like that if anything actually happened. But at least he'd have had something to hold on to, like those polystyrene floats when you're learning to swim. Walking down the front path of a bungalow that's supposedly a portal to the land of the Fae, armed with nothing deadlier than a single manila wallet file, takes more than courage. You have to be really courageous, brave as two short planks, fearless as a hatter, to do something like that. He still wasn't sure he'd come to the right place, though. In the middle of the lawn was a clump of those carved wooden mushrooms surrounding the water feature, and the sign hanging from the porch read Brooksmead. As if that wasn't enough, the door chimes played Viva España. "Hello," Paul said as the door opened. The man who'd opened it was elderly, bald, wearing a fawn cardigan with frayed elbows. Excuse me," Paul went on, "but I'm looking for the portal." The man nodded. "Hold on," he said. "I'll fetch her." He turned and shouted over his shoulder, "Hey, it's some bloke about the portal." The television that had been burbling in the background cut out abruptly, and the man was replaced by a woman of similar vintage, wearing a lilac jumper and curlers. "You here for the portal, love?" she asked. Paul nodded. "Right you are, then," she said. "Watch the step." Paul duly tripped over the step, nearly flattening her, and followed her down a long, deep-carpeted hall. A small dog, possibly a Yorkshire Terrier or some similar brand, yapped behind him as he trudged. She showed him into a sun lounge, in the centre of which was a wagon wheel converted into a coffee table. "There you go," she said. "Won't be a tick." She left, leaving Paul alone with the table, a large straw donkey wearing a Spanish hat, and the small yappy dog. It was some time before Paul realised that the dog had 3 heads. He stared. It was still a small, yappy dog, and round the place where its 3 necks met was a tartan flea collar. One of its mouths held a small rubber ball, and its tail was wagging. Christ, Paul thought, and kept perfectly still until the woman came back. "You done this before?" she asked. When Paul shook his head, she smiled reassuringly. Paul was not reassured, and said, "There's nothing to worry about. All you've got to do is drink this, sit down in the chair and close your eyes. Nothing to it, really." Whatever this was, it came in a mug inscribed "The World's Best Grandad." It tasted like cold, sweet tea. There was also a plate of mixed biscuits, but apparently they weren't compulsory. The chair was one of those canvas and steel tube lounges, and the dog seemed to think that Paul was trespassing when he sat on it. It growled at him, but its tail was still wagging. "Soon as I close my eyes," he thought, "the bugger's going to lick me to death." But by then his eyes had closed anyway, and at that juncture things took a turn for the worse. It would have been harder to handle if he hadn't been to the bank with Benny Shumway. The landscape was different. A vast brown heath stretching out as far as the eye could see, but the lighting and general ambience were pretty much the same. It was bleak and cold. It seemed to say that creatures who breathed weren't welcome here. It was probably safe to assume that there were no public toilets. "We had better be going." Paul looked up in surprise and saw he wasn't alone. Standing next to him was a tall, dark-haired woman in a smart suit. She was maybe 5 years older than him, handsome rather than pretty, with glasses, also a marked German accent. "Monica? Natürlich. You see me as I was before I transformed." She hesitated, and her manner suggested that hesitation wasn't something that came naturally to her. "We must hurry," she said awkwardly, "but I do not know the way." I... What he wanted to say was that he was really, really glad she was with him, not because he expected her to do all the heroism or even map read, though he'd be prepared to bet money that she'd be better than him at both, but because this wasn't a place where he wanted to be alone. "Neither do I," he said. Let's go that way." Paul wasn't even aware in which direction he was pointing. Why? Monica asked, puzzled. I don't know, he replied, but it's a 4-to-1 chance and perhaps we'll be lucky. That is a very bad reason, Monica replied. However, you are in charge, we should go. She sounded braver than he felt, lion-hearted as a brush. Fine, he said, and started to walk. But you are going west, she objected behind him. You said to go northeast. Whatever, he shivered. I have a feeling that it doesn't greatly matter. Where we need to go will probably find us, unless, he added with feeling, we're really lucky. That does not make sense, Monica objected, scampering a few steps to catch up with him. This is not how we are accustomed to doing such things in my country. First we research thoroughly the geography of the place we are going. Do you have a map? Paul shook his head. I don't think this place would fit on a map, he said. I don't think it's that sort of... He stopped dead. A nasty thought had just struck him. How do we get back? He asked. She was staring at him. You don't know? No. How about you? I've never done anything like this before, Monica admitted. I do not know the approved procedure. You should have researched it before you left the office. Paul shrugged. Don't suppose it's going to matter much, he said gloomily. Yeah, you know what, he added, as he pulled his foot out of a pool of black mud. I think this is even worse than the bank. She frowned. I do not understand, she said. My father works for the Rheinische Staatsbank in Stuttgart. It is nothing like this. No kidding. He stopped again and looked around. Nothing to be seen for miles and miles except desolate moorland, with here and there a black stagnant tarn or a cluster of granite rocks. Suddenly Paul felt tired, as though 6 months of weariness had only just caught up with him. Showing off, he said to himself. Effective magic. Either they can hurt me or they can't, but I haven't got the time or the energy for all this stupid ambience. Bugger walking, he said. Let's just wait here and see what happens. But, Monica began to object, and then she stopped talking and stared at a low, grass-covered mound no more than 10 yards away to her left. That was not there before, she said quietly. No, Paul agreed. Told you all we had to do was stay put and be patient. Ah, he added as the door opened in the side of the mound, leaking pale green light. That'll be for us, I expect. Well, come on, we haven't got all day. Paul, wait. Unless the German for Paul was a Scheitzkopf, she'd never called him by his name before. We cannot go in there. It's not safe. He shook his head. It's all right, he said. It'll just turn out to be a dungeon or a tomb or something, or maybe a really amazing hall with torchlight and pretty furniture. Makes no odds, one way or another. You coming or what? Without looking round to see if she was following, he stepped through the door into the green light. In spite of his new and hard-won cynicism, Paul was impressed. It was as though Peter Jackson and Lawrence Llewellyn Bowen had been hired to make over hell with a long list of product placements to fit in wherever possible. A long green fire ran the length of a broad Hollywood medieval hall, oak-panelled and hammer-beam-roofed, painted and gilded. Polished tables and carved benches flanked the hearth, and the walls were masked by acres of richly coloured tapestries, a grotesque combination of flowers, wildlife, court and battle scenes. Though the flames from the hearth were taller than he was, the place was icy cold, like a flame-effect electric fire with the elements turned off. Paul yawned ostentatiously and called out, "Hello? Anybody home?" "You should not shout like that," Monica hissed beside him. "It's not respectful. We must not anger them." Paul grinned and walked down the hall towards the high table that crossed the tea at the end. He'd have been more impressed if he hadn't seen it all before, in his mind's eye, when he was 12 and they had to read Tolkien at school. True, he hadn't imagined it in quite such detail. The quaint carved bosses and misericors, for example, with their funny little faces and cartoon-like monsters and dragons. He'd been rather vague about how the beams actually kept the roof up, whereas whoever was responsible for this dot had done his homework, read up about plates, purlins, studs and ties. Still, the overall design was complete plagiarism, and they were going to have to do better than this if they wanted to get his disbelief suspended. As if on cue, a side door opened and a small child came in, a girl about 10 years old. "There you are," she said. "Like it?" Paul shrugged. "Not bad," he said. "The gilding's rather tacky, and the green fire is probably a mistake, but you're on the right lines. Now, if it's all the same to you, I'd like to see the manager." Paul could feel Monica tensing up next to him, but the girl just grinned. "You sure you want to do that?" she said. "No," Paul replied, looking past her at a tapestry of silver unicorns and a field of golden flowers. "But it's not up to me. Can we get on, please? I'd like to be home in time for Buffy, if it's all the same to you." The girl raised an eyebrow. "We're impressed," she said. "We were expecting a snivelling little wimp. If you've suddenly come over all brave, it could save us all a lot of time." "Not brave," Paul replied. "Just bored. Scared stiff too, of course, but not impressed, if you see what I mean. I'm guessing that the scary stuff is what I can't see. Would that be right?" The little girl didn't answer. Instead, she swept him an exaggerated curtsy and went out of the way she'd come in. Nothing much happened for a while, and Paul sat down on the nearest bench. Monica was horrified. "You must not do that," she said. "We do not know what dreadful enchantments it may be." Paul sighed. "Don't worry about it," he said. "This is all strictly industrial light and magic, while they're figuring out what to do next. Or else they've already figured it out, and it takes a while to get everything ready. In any case, nothing bad's going to happen to us yet. Sit down, take the weight off your tyres. We could be here for some time." Monica hesitated and then sat down beside him. "Mr. Carpenter," she said gravely, "there is something I would like to know, but it's personal." Paul picked a dried bulrush off the floor and held the end of it in the green fire. As he'd expected, it didn't even char. "Go ahead," he said. "Well," she frowned, reminding him vaguely of someone or other, "I have to say it. You do not seem to be behaving normally. Your manner is different. I do not understand." Paul felt the end of the bulrush, quite cool, and threw it away. "You're right," he said, "and I don't understand either. I think it was when we walked through the door, or maybe a little before that. I suddenly realised I didn't feel—" He stopped. "I was going to say I didn't feel frightened anymore, but that's not true at all. It's more," he shrugged, "I think the word I'm after is intimidated. And sorry," he added, "I haven't a clue how to say that in German." "No problem," Monica said. "I know what is intimidated. You do not feel inferior and out of place." Paul nodded. "That's it," he said. "It's like I've been here before. Actually, it's more than that. This is going to sound pretty weird, but it's almost as if I feel like I'm at home here. But not in a good way," he added. "Like it's familiar, but I don't like it much. It feels like, I don't know, sort of like Heathrow Airport or some big government office if I worked there. And that's strange," he added thoughtfully, "because obviously I've never been in a place like this before. Ever. The fires are fake, by the way. No heat or anything. I think where they went wrong was making it green. It's unconvincing. It's like they have a vague idea what I'm expecting to see, but they don't understand. Like words copied out of a book by someone who doesn't know the language." Monica shivered. "It's very cold," she said. "I do not like it here." "Me neither. Is there a bell we could ring or something? It's just psychology making us wait around like this. But I'd rather get to the next bit." "Excellent." Paul looked up to see who'd spoken. The little girl was back, and apparently she brought her friends. He wasn't sure if they were the same kids he'd come across at the garage in the middle of nowhere, or whether they just looked very much like them. Excuse me?" he said. "You're doing very well," they said. They all spoke at the same time, but Paul could hear only one voice. "Better than we expected, anyhow. We think you're ready to move on. How about it?" Monica had grabbed Paul's arm as if to warn him, but he took no notice. "I'm up for that," he said. "What's involved exactly?" "That'd be telling," the children replied. They were all, he noticed, wearing either sky blue or lilac, and identical blue and white trainers. "But since you're being a good sport, we'll give you a clue. This is," they giggled, "this is child's play. Now we're going to take you somewhere a bit scary. Do you want to continue, or have you had enough? If you want to back out now, that's fine." At the far end of the hall, a small dog was barking. It wore a tartan flea collar and had 3 heads. "You can go back the way you came, and no hard feelings." Paul thought for a moment. There was, after all, absolutely no reason why he should go on. Was there? He'd got this far, made an effort, and he'd never wanted to be a hero in the first place. Honour was satisfied. Except that Countess Judy had told him they were holding Benny Shumway hostage. and there wasn't anybody else who could get him out of there. Wasn't there? Bullshit. There was Professor Van Spee, who was supposed to be some sort of really high-powered wizard, or Mr. Suslovich, who was a giant, or couldn't Dennis Tanner come bursting in with an army of goblins? Or why couldn't Countess Judy do it herself? Wasn't she supposed to be the queen of the Fae? It didn't make sense what she said. If Benny hadn't been able to deal with these creeps, what possible chance had Paul got? On the other hand, there was a lot he didn't understand about the firm's business, mostly because nobody had bothered to tell him. Maybe he really was the only one who could save Benny Shumway, and Benny was his friend? Hardly that. Benny Shumway was just some very strange short guy who'd once been grateful to him for coming with him to the bank. That was hardly a life debt. "I think we should go back now," Monica said quietly. But Paul shook his head. The gesture surprised him. He was under the impression that he was still making up his mind. Apparently not. "No thanks," he told the children. "I'm ready when you are." The children grinned at him. "Excellent," they said. The lights went out and almost immediately came back up again. The shock hit Paul like a hammer. The mood he was in, he could probably have handled something strange and unfamiliar, since that was what he'd been bracing himself against. What he saw when the light came back was the very last thing he'd been expecting. It was also so familiar, so ordinary, as to constitute his mental default setting. That was scary. He was sitting on a bed. His bed. The duvet was dark blue with red polka dots. He'd always hated it, from the day his mum brought it home from Marx's sale, but she'd never taken any of his hints to that effect. Above him, a cluster of dusty Spitfires and Messerschmitts dangled from bits of fishing line. From the poster on the wall opposite, the crew of the starship Voyager smiled blandly over his head. He was home.